Ms. Ting.
Mr. Speaker, as the world gathers for COP27 this month, it is clearer than ever that the need for more action to reduce our carbon emissions is pressing. It is why we are debating amendments to the Carbon Pricing Act today. In April this year, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sounded a warning that we are running out of time to make changes to limit global warming. It concluded that limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025, meaning in the next 3 years, and to drop by 43% by 2030. Even a more conservative target of 2 degrees warmer still requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest, and to be reduced by a quarter by 2030. While some decarbonizing strategies rely heavily on the development of new technologies, we need to continue to pursue other avenues to ensure that we are properly supporting the green transition. These range from, amongst others, consumer education about necessary lifestyle changes, tackling greenwashing, to ensuring that our financial system is set up to properly and sustainably support the shift to a climate-conscious economy, and also to coming up with a carbon pricing regime that equitably balances various considerations that come into play. Indeed, a report fronted by McKinsey Sustainability in January 2022 warned that it is not technology which is the main limiting factor, but it is instead the big shifts in thinking and large-scale financing needed that are far behind schedule. More importantly, precisely because so many of these areas and approaches are relatively new, we must make sure that in our rush to do something about the problem, we take a moment to evaluate the effects and consequences of our policies. After all, well-intentioned but ultimately inappropriate policies may turn out to be even more costly to unwind when we are further down the path. This is why we support the move to further refine our carbon tax regime, which is a key prong in a multifaceted approach for our transition to a green economy. The largest contribution to Singapore's emissions undoubtedly comes from industry, and while it is industry that has been important for our economy, its decarbonization is crucial, and our policy should be in place to speed progress and to be transparent along the way. On this note, I therefore wish to seek an amendment to the bill before us, the text of which is contained in the order paper supplement for the reasons below. Currently, the bill allows for facilities to surrender international carbon credits, or ICCs, for up to 5% of the taxable emissions. Clause 33B of the bill provides an exception where the minister may permit eligible international carbon credits to be surrendered in excess of the prescribed limit in any particular case or class of cases. This means that the percentage could be increased to more than 5% if the minister permits. Allowing facilities to use ICCs for a sizable portion of their emissions may mean that facilities end up having less incentive to cut down on taxable emissions, as they do not have to pay tax on that portion of emissions. Many members in this House have spoken on the regimes allowing surrendering of up to 5% of their taxable emissions, and in particular, my Sengkang colleague, Mr. Louis Chua, during this year's Committee of Supply, asked about what accountability measures will be put in place to ensure transparency and fair implementation of this regime. This question is still pertinent today. How will the minister decide when to lift the prescribed limit? Is there a framework to constrain this decision-making process? I therefore have sought to make the amendments as listing the decisions of the minister on the public registry will allow both industry players and civil society to observe the use of ICCs over the years and whether particular facilities are over-reliant on the use of ICCs. First, the danger with allowing facilities to continuously use ICCs beyond the prescribed limit is that facilities may look to purchase ICCs with low and favorable prices. This could mean that the cost of producing emissions is significantly less than the cost of paying tax on emissions, which creates a disconnect between the purposes of carbon tax and the permitted use of ICCs. Instead of being compelled by the prevailing carbon tax to cut down their emissions, the entity owning facilities may turn their efforts to purchasing favorable ICCs instead. The problem is exacerbated by how different ICCs may have different criteria for pricing credits. The value of credits also changes through rounds of trading between entities. The worth of each credit in a different ICC framework and at different time periods is different, and the entity owning facilities can exploit these differences to obtain credits that give them the greatest financial advantage. This defeats the purpose of having a fixed carbon tax that has carefully calibrated increases over the years to discourage emissions, and in particular, to make emissions increasingly expensive over time. Second, having the public registry listing the minister's decisions will also be a first step in examining whether the use of ICCs indeed fits its purpose of allowing facilities some leeway in producing emissions only in the near to medium term. If facilities continue to surrender ICCs for many years beyond the prescribed limit, this indicates that they may not have found a way to reduce emissions adequately to avoid paying carbon tax excessively. Third, requiring the minister to state their reasons for granting permission to surrender ICCs beyond the prescribed limit ensures that we are told the reasons for such decisions upfront, reducing the need for unhelpful speculation or even false rumors to take bed. It can also give comfort that the minister has indeed carefully considered the issue of the surrender of ICCs in respect of each facility. Note too that I have not in the amendment asked for a disclosure of the amount surrendered, as we recognize the commercial sensitivity surrounding this information, particularly in the market environment that is still finding its feet, so to speak. Finally, my proposed amendment is also in line with the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative's Claims Costs Code of Practice, which calls for the transparent reporting of information. The Code of Practice states that companies must disclose how carbon credits are used towards their climate targets, including whether or not the carbon credit is associated with corresponding adjustments by the host and/or buyer country. In addition, I would like to seek clarification on the quality and eligibility of carbon credits. I understand that the National Environment Agency, NEA, has signed separate MOUs with Vera and Gold Standard to support Singapore-based companies in using eligible carbon credits issued by Vera and Gold Standard to meet part of their carbon tax obligations in Singapore. However, there is little further information on the criteria for eligible credits and the ability to verify the carbon lowering activities of such ICCs is key. Could the Minister let us know when we can expect further details on the prescribed criteria as set out in Clause 33A, and how are these criteria being formulated? It is also precisely because the market for ICCs is still new and highly unstandardized that makes it difficult to quantify, and therefore their use can be controversial. Indeed, academics and environmental groups are concerned that the use of carbon credits could hinder, delay, or even displace environmental efforts. Key aspects of ICCs have not yet been standardized, and robust verification mechanisms have not been developed to be applied uniformly across various markets, unlike in the case of commodities, for example, which are traded using industry-specific standardized contracts. The under-regulation of carbon markets also means that there is a risk for greenwashing, a topic which I will come back to later. If carbon credits themselves are not rigorously regulated, it may end up hindering emissions reductions by reducing the pressure on regulators and thus businesses to aggressively commit to investing in cleaner technologies and to move away from high emissions activities. There is also concern that there have been consistent overestimations of emissions reductions in the past. Studies conducted on two of the world's largest offset programs, which are both administered by the United Nations under the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, and Joint Implementation, JI, have found approximately 60 to 70% of their offset credits may not represent valid emissions reductions. Adding to the mix is the difficulty in proving a counterfactual. That is, it is hard to prove that offset programs made something happen that would not otherwise have happened regardless of the program's existence. This is often referred to as additionality. Yet in spite of all of this, the ICCs continue to have a role to play during the intervening years of our green transition. Limitations of today's technologies mean that hard-to-abate sectors still find it difficult to eliminate emissions. While costs may drop as we continue to work on better and cheaper technology solutions, high-quality ICCs are a way for businesses to plug the gap in the meantime. Our emissions reduction pathway to the 1.5-degree warming target still requires carbon offsets to play a role. Because of the above reasons, ICCs cannot be the only tool in our market's toolkit to facilitate the green transition. Some of the lessons learned and concerns from the green and sustainability financial markets are also useful when we look at ICCs. I shall now turn to them. I note that closer to home, MAS has been making efforts to grow the size of the market here in Singapore and to improve both accessibility to SMEs and also to maintain an eye on sustainability credentials. Initiatives such as GSLS and Project Greenpoint aim to do just that, and we have also seen that the local green bond market has grown from around Singapore dollars 1 billion 5 years ago to 14.4 billion last year. The amount of green loans too has grown from 2.9 billion in 2018 to 17 billion last year. Green financing and the development of robust and large financial markets for green instruments play a very important role to support enterprises and economies towards a decarbonized future. Various financial institutions have been active in developing these markets, and various banks have committed to contributing large amounts to sustainable financing and investment by 2030. This is in itself a good thing. Green instruments like sustainability-linked bonds or SLBs are ways in which businesses can gain access to financing for investment and other activities which are ostensibly for the purpose of transitioning to more sustainable activities. However, the nature of the market at the moment means that companies, the borrowers, pay experts and consultancies to set appropriate sustainability targets and to evaluate these during the course of the bond and to check whether these targets are being met. Lenders or arrangers too would like to be able to announce that they have a large amount of green loans or bonds on their books. In fact, all three parties benefit by being able to tout their involvement in green financing deals. This leaves a question about whether there is sufficient pressure and whether there is enough independent oversight being exercised to lower the risk of greenwashing. Compounding the problem is that the structure of these green instruments may not have enough negative incentives to make issuers do all they can to meet the sustainability targets set. For sustainability-linked bonds in particular, the funds are not ring-fenced, making them vulnerable to greenwashing and allows financing to continue to be used by issuers to fund carbon-intensive expenses and projects. More generally, penalties by way of bumps of less than 100 bips in the amount of increased interest payable is paltry, especially if these are percentages agreed to by the companies themselves, and often represent amounts that are tiny fractions that work out to be far under 1% of the annual revenue of these issuers. And while it is true that there are attempts to create standards for sustainability and green targets that issuers and borrowers are expected to meet, such attempts are often voluntary in nature, like the ICMA's Green Bond Principles and Sustainability-Linked Bond Principles, and they do not address the lack of common disclosure frameworks for each asset class of green instruments, and the technical nature of the green or sustainability data points themselves make it open to uncertainty. Furthermore, taxonomies like the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance are still works in progress, and it is not clear if they will be voluntary or compulsory. This lack of meaningful standardization and uncertainty means that green financing is particularly vulnerable to greenwashing. The private nature of green loans compared with bonds, which tend to be public instruments, also makes it difficult for good data to be readily available to understand the picture more clearly. It is against the backdrop that I believe an Exim Bank can really come into its own, and my colleague from Sengkang, James Lim, earlier mentioned how an Exim Bank can play its role in developing green financial markets. I would like to take that one step further by repeating our calls for an Exim Bank to be direct and to ask for an Exim Bank to be directly involved in financing green loans and arranging green and sustainability-linked bonds for our enterprises, with a view to using the rich trove of data available from this to either fine-tune existing taxonomies or to develop a set of robust and internationally acceptable set of standards, which we would then export to the rest of the region and world for wider adoption. The Exim Bank, having a direct role as a lender or arranger, has the added benefit of knowing exactly what the terms of its loans and instruments are. It can also have a special focus on providing financing options for the research of newer and cheaper green technologies, especially those which are more applicable to the specificities of Singapore and the region's energy and industrial needs. Additionally, the bank would also have access to commercially sensitive information like the exact terms of its covenants, where they are breached or require waivers, and will naturally have harmonization of disclosure built in. It will also be a natural complement to Project Greenprint's aims of addressing the data challenges of gaps in green and sustainability financial markets. Coming back to ICCs, many of the principles that I have just outlined also apply. I believe the above points are the reasons why Singapore has committed to the 5% threshold, and it is also important to note that our commitment is to high-quality ICCs. But given the risks outlined above, I believe we can and should put information out in the public domain where possible, including the public register for waivers of the threshold for ICCs, which would send a clear signal to emitters that buying their way towards net zero is not an option. Likewise, we can also ensure that having another effective tool in the box by developing high-quality green financial markets and instruments which have consistently good standards applied to ensure that the possibility of greenwashing is much reduced. This will go a ways to ease the transition to a less carbon-intensive world. Mr. Speaker, as some of our fellow Singaporeans represent us to the world at COP this week, I hope we support them by putting our money where our mouth is. We must continue to pursue real decarbonisation in order to ensure that irreversible warming does not become the reality for our planet's future. Thank you.
Order. I propose to take a break now. Suspend the sitting and we'll take the chair at 3:14 p.m. Order. Order.